What's up, dings and dongettes? True Diltom here. Welcome back to the channel that is not antagonistic towards markets, but acknowledges that viewing markets and barter as integrated into human nature is destructive. So, we left off explaining that there is no barter without money, even if there is no cash or coinage. And we were about to explain how Graeber recalls the Sumerian economy as a more historical tale of the creation of money, barter, and so on. So, let's continue. He writes, quote, "The Sumerian economy was dominated by vast temple and palace complexes. These were often staffed by thousands, priests and officials, craftspeople who worked in their industrial workshops, farmers and shepherds who worked their considerable estates. Even though ancient Sumer was usually divided into a large number of independent city-states, by the time the curtain goes up on Mesopotamian civilization around 3500 BC, temple administrators already appear to have developed a single uniform system of accountancy, one that is in some ways still with us. Actually, because it's to the Sumerians that we owe such things as the dozen or the 24-hour day. The basic monetary unit was the silver shekel. 1 shekel's weight in silver was established as the equivalent of 1 gur or bushel or barley. A shekel was subdivided into 60 minas, corresponding to 1 portion of barley on the principle that there were 30 days in a month, and temple workers received 2 rations of barley every day. It's easy to see that money in this sense is no way the product of commercial transactions. It was actually created by bureaucrats in order to keep track of resources and move things back and forth between departments. Temple bureaucrats used the system to calculate debts, rent, fees, loans in silver. Silver was effectively money, and it did indeed circulate in the form of unworked chunks, rude bars as Smith had put it. In this he was right, but it was almost the only part of his account that was right. One reason was that silver did not circulate very much, most of it just sat around in temple and palace treasuries, some of which remained carefully guarded in the same place for literally thousands of years. It would have been easy enough to standardize the ingots, stamp them, create some authoritative system to guarantee their purity. The technology existed, yet no one saw any particular need to do so. One reason was that while debts were calculated in silver, they did not have to be paid in silver. In fact, they could be paid in more or less anything one had around. Peasants who owed money to the temple or palace, or to some temple or palace official, seemed to have settled their debts mostly in barley, which is why fixing the ratio of silver to barley was so important. But it was perfectly acceptable to show up with goats or furniture or lapis lazuli. Temples and palaces were huge industrial operations. They could find a use for almost anything. In the marketplaces that cropped up in Mesopotamian cities, prices were also calculated in silver, and the price of commodities that weren't entirely controlled by the temples and palaces would tend to fluctuate according to supply and demand. But even here, such evidence as we have suggests that most transactions were based on credit. Merchants, who sometimes worked for the temples, sometimes operated independently, were among the few people who did often actually use silver in transactions, but even they mostly did much of their dealings on credit, and ordinary people buying beer from alewomen or local innkeepers once again did so by running up a tab to be settled at harvest time in barley or anything they might have had at hand. At this point, just about every aspect of the conventional story of the origins of money lay in rubble. Rarely has an historical theory been so absolutely and systematically refuted, end quote. So to sum up, the earliest accounts of money are not for the purpose of exchange, but for internal bureaucratic accounting, the citizenry having little use for coinage or currency. In economics, the story typically goes that we begin with barter, discover money, and then develop credit systems, but historically, it all happened the other way around. Early civilizations used a system of credit without money, and physical coinage came much later. While barter, on the other hand, is not a prototype for money, but an accidental byproduct of it. It's what currency users do when they are cut off from their currency. So there are other theories of money that don't view money as a commodity for the purpose of exchanging for other commodities. One such example is credit theory of money that sees money as a means of accounting. This means money need not be attached to gold or silver or a commodity because money exists as an abstraction. It is a unit of measurement. But if it doesn't measure a commodity, what does it measure? The credit theory of currency says the answer is debt. Graeber writes, quote, "Credit theorists insisted that money is not a commodity but an accounting tool. In other words, it is not a thing at all. You can no more touch a dollar or a Deutschmark than you can touch an hour or a cubic centimeter. Units of currency are merely abstract units of measurement." And as the credit theorist correctly noted, historically such abstract systems of accounting emerged long before the use of any particular token of exchange. The obvious next question is, if money is just a yardstick, what then does it measure? The answer was simple: debt. A coin is, effectively, an IOU, whereas conventional wisdom holds that a banknote is, or should be, a promise to pay a certain amount of real money. Gold, silver, whatever that might be taken to mean. Credit theorists argued that a banknote is simply the promise to pay something of the same value as an ounce of gold. But that's all that money ever is. There's no fundamental difference in this respect between a silver dollar, a Susan B. Anthony dollar coin made of a copper-nickel alloy designed to look vaguely like gold, a green piece of paper with a picture of George Washington on it, or a digital blip on some bank's computer. Conceptually, the idea that a piece of gold is really just an IOU is always rather difficult to wrap one's head around, but something like this must be true, because even when gold and silver coins were in use, they almost never circulated at their bullion value, end quote. So Graeber then goes on to explain a situation similar to Smith's land of barter, but rather this scenario is a land of credit money. If we go with Smith's land of barter, imagine a small village where the bow maker person A gives one of his neighbors, person B, a bow. Person B doesn't give anything to person A in exchange for the bow, but rather gives him an IOU. If person B comes up with anything useful in the future, person A can claim it, and the IOU expires. But what if instead of person A waiting for person B to come up with something, he also owed a bow to a third person C, and so he passed on his IOU to them as payment? Then, if person C wanted something from a fourth person D, he could hand them the IOU to acquire it. This process could go on as long as people have faith in person B to pay his debt. It could go along until the original issuer of the IOU is forgotten. This is the function of money according to credit theorists. Person B could have given a gold coin as a token of his obligation to return a favor, and it would have been the same because again, money is not a commodity but a unit of measurement. No one accepted gold coins because they wanted gold, but because they knew others would want it. But in this hypothetical scenario, person A giving away an IOU from person B, what reason is there to think people would continue to trust that person B would fulfill his obligation? While also, couldn't people just fake IOUs, forge person B's signature, etc.? Person B would have to be extremely rich to not only provide enough tokens for everyone to use, but also to guarantee all of them. So person B must be a sovereign. This is where Graeber departs from a land of barter like fantasy land and enters reality. The IOU can't become currency without the state, and whatever a currency is simply interested in establishing uniform systems of weights and measures, and such systems usually prevail consistently for long periods of time. While one might also notice that the IOU given by person B can only act as money insofar as person B never pays his debt. Graeber points out this is exactly how the Bank of England was successfully established at the first modern central bank. In 1694, a group of English bankers made a loan of £1,200,000 to the king and were given in return a monopoly on the issuance of banknotes. This meant they could now advance IOUs for a portion of what was now owed to them, just as person A had to person C, handing out IOUs to the person such that the king now owed the citizenry, circulating and monetizing the debt. The bankers even got to charge the king 8% annual interest for the original loan, in addition to the clients that borrowed it. But the loan to this day was never paid back, nor can it be because the entire monetary system of Great Britain is built on it. Graeber writes, quote, "During the reign of Henry II, 1154 to 1189, just about everyone in Western Europe was still keeping their accounts using the monetary system established by Charlemagne some 350 years earlier, that is, using pounds, shillings, and pence, despite the fact that some of these coins had never existed. Charlemagne never actually struck a silver pound. None of Charlemagne's actual shillings and pence remained in circulation, and those coins that did circulate tended to vary enormously in size, weight, purity, and value. This doesn't really matter. What matters is that there is a uniform system for measuring credits and debts, and that this system remains stable over time. The case of Charlemagne's currency is particularly dramatic because his actual empire dissolved quite quickly, but the monetary system he created continued to be used for keeping accounts within his former territories for more than 800 years. It was referred to in the 16th century quite explicitly as imaginary money, and deniers and livres were only completely abandoned as units of account around the time of the French Revolution. Graeber continues, whether or not the actual physical money stuff in circulation corresponds to this imaginary money is not particularly important. It makes no real difference whether it's pure silver, debased silver, leather tokens, or dried cod, provided the state is willing to accept it in payment of taxes, because whatever the state is willing to accept, for that reason, became currency. One of the most important forms of currency in England in Henry's time were notched tally sticks used to record debts. Tally sticks were quite explicitly IOUs. Both parties to a transaction would take a hazelwood twig, notch it to indicate the amount owed, and then split it in half. The creditor would keep one half called the stock, hence the origin of the term stockholder, and the debtor kept the other called the stub, hence the origin of the term ticket stub. Tax assessors used such twigs to calculate amounts owed by local sheriffs. Often though, rather than wait for the taxes to come due, Henry's exchequer would often sell the tallies at a discount, and they would circulate as tokens of debt owed to the government to anyone willing to trade for them. Modern banknotes actually work on a similar principle, except in reverse." End quote. One of the problems such an explanation of money solves that Smiths cannot is one of incentives. Sovereigns tax their population such that they have the funds available to them to eliminate threats to their rule, both inside and outside their jurisdiction. But as most libertarians will tell you, they also tax to increase their personal income. So the problem with someone like Smith's explanation of money as a commodity is that if money isn't a unit for measuring debt, but is rather a commodity that is most effectively expressed as gold and silver, regardless of what the government does, when sovereigns historically capture gold and silver mines, why even extract it into equal quantities, stamp one's face on it, and circulate it amongst the citizenry with the intention of extracting it once again through taxation? If money is pre-government and is naturally occurring as a commodity, then getting one's hands on that commodity is all that matters to increase one's personal income. Surely, circulating it as coinage won't increase the amount of gold or silver. It turns out the reason why is because markets and money don't emerge spontaneously, but are created by sovereigns. It is from the same process described thus far that markets come into being. Writing on the fact that stateless society is without markets, Graeber writes, quote, "Let us take a hypothetical example. Say a king wishes to support a standing army of 50,000 men. Under ancient or medieval conditions, feeding such a force was an enormous problem unless they were on the march. One would need to employ almost as many men and animals just to locate, acquire, and transport the necessary provisions. On the other hand, if one simply hands out coins to the soldiers and then demands that every family in the kingdom was obliged to pay one of those coins back to you, one would, in one blow, turn one's entire national economy into a vast machine for the provisioning of soldiers, since now every family, in order to get their hands on the coins, must find some way to contribute to the general effort to provide soldiers with things they want. Markets are brought into existence as a side effect. This is a bit of a cartoon version, but it is very clear that markets did spring up around ancient armies. One only need take a glance at Cotilia's Arthasasatra, the Sasanian Circle of Sovereignty, or the Chinese discourse on salt and iron, to discover that most ancient rulers spent a great deal of their time thinking about the relation between mines, soldiers, taxes, and food. most concluded that the creation of markets of this sort was not just convenient for feeding soldiers, but useful in all sorts of ways, since it means officials no longer had to requisition everything they needed directly from the populace, or figure out a way to produce it on royal estates or royal workshops. In other words, despite the dogged liberal assumption, again coming from Smith's legacy, that the existence of states and markets are somehow opposed, the historical record implies that exactly the opposite is the case. Stateless societies tend also to be without markets, end quote. So the image we have painted thus far is that money is created for the purpose of internal bureaucratic accounting. It is then used to finance armies and soldiers, and then markets are created for soldiers to use the money they have been given. One of the historical examples of rulers creating markets from where there weren't any through money is in Madagascar during French colonization, where General Gallieni issued a tax only payable in a newly issued currency that had been distributed to the people of Madagascar, before being demanded that some of it be paid back through a tax. How the tax would eventually be paid back was through the mostly agricultural natives selling their crops, mostly rice, to Chinese and Indian merchants who had set themselves up in proximity to them. In addition, the new tax fell on harvest time when rice was priced very low, so to avoid selling off too much of their produce such that they wouldn't have any left for personal consumption, many natives would look for work in the city to work for wages. This is why the tax was appropriately titled the education tax, as it was intended to introduce the framing of capitalist society. Successfully introducing a new system of values, the natives were now plugged into the consumptive life of the French and the unconscious framing that markets provide. This is one historical example of the state making markets from where there were none, and European colonialism tends to be littered with examples of market making, which is its own practice alongside state making. So this way of thinking surely runs up against the way Adam Smith and free market absolutists thought about the world. One famous economist to think up an alternative tradition to credit paralleling what we have been saying is John Maynard Keynes, the big skip himself. Often classical economists will criticize Keynes for being a historian and not a real economist, but given the whole assumption of the economy as being an independent entity is shaky, in what way is this a criticism? But that being said, in the 20s, Keynes intensely studied Mesopotamian banking records, looking for the origins of money. Keynes wrote in his treatise on money that money is a tool of the state, and always has been throughout observable history. The idea of money as a commodity is thus a pure abstraction, and Keynes wrote that the state enforces the agreements of credit and debt. People make contracts and take out debts that they have to pay in the future. The state then not only enforces the payment, but by what means the debt will be paid. This is money, and Graeber highlights that it would be from this that Keynes would assert the bank creates money, and that there is no limit to their ability to do so. He writes that however much the bank lends, the borrowers will have no choice but to put the money back into some bank again, and thus, from the perspective of the banking system as a whole, the total number of debts and credits will always cancel out. From these assumptions, we reach conclusions that depart from the liberal vision of the economy and realize that markets are children of the state and will fail if the state isn't there to take care of them. But Keynesian economics is maybe a subject for another video. I'd like to give a shout out to Imperius as well. He really introduced me to the subject of much of my videos, but this one in particular. I want to make a few videos on formalist economics, and so I must thank Imperius for doing so much for me and the Discord on not only this issue, but generative anthropology and much else also. So anyway guys, I'll catch you later.